It is such an honour, Dame Elish and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, to have been asked to do this talk. And it was a huge honour for me to be in Burma for the 4 years that I was there, from 2009 to 2013 as the British ambassador. It's always slightly unnerving when there's a former ambassador in the room. Robert is there, so he'll pick me up if I get any of this wrong, so I'm going to have to cut a lot of my speech, I think, where I'm just going to freelance a bit. But it is an enormous honour, and thank you all very much for coming along. And it is, I think, an indication to me. I found this from the moment I arrived in Burma and when people knew I was going. The interest is just phenomenal in the UK, and that was part of the reason why I was so interested and applied for the job in the first place. But even after all the changes and the fact that it's moved into a slightly quieter period now, it still is an area and a country that people feel immensely connected to, and no place more so than here in Oxford. And I thought it was right, given that it is the Aung San Suu Kyi lecture, to start with a quote that she made when she was here back in June 2012. And I slightly cheated because Dame Elish has a lovely quote from her, the one about being nice on your introductory words to St Hugh's, so I couldn't use that one, but I tried another one instead. And I remember thinking, so many talks that I gave when I was much smaller than this, when I came back having been ambassador, and I say, I just hope one day that Sue can be here instead of me delivering this talk, and there she was a year ago, and she was back, I think, recently, or you saw her recently again in the UK. So it does show quite how much things have changed, because that would have been truly unthinkable when, back in 2009, that she might have come to the UK, felt safe enough to come to the UK, that she would get back again. So things have changed hugely, but the aspiration she talks about there, about the young people of Burma and their aspiration to live a happy life and having the opportunity to lead one, is still very much in doubt. And that's really some of the, I want to just to try to sort of expose a few of those issues tonight, as well as give what is effectively quite a personal take on the 4 years that I spent in Burma. And this, I was trying to think where to start, because 50 minutes is quite a galling, I'm going to fill 50 minutes, and it's quite a difficult task to be given. And then actually I found by the time I finished, you may find I've spoken for more than that, because it is just so much to pack in. I hope it won't be quite that long, or if it is, you won't notice the time passing. But I decided that actually it's probably best to start pretty much in 2009 when I went there. You could start in pre-colonial times, colonial times, independence. But I think this fairly personal look that I'm going to give tonight, this is, if you look at that situation, I mean, there's not many countries that would have that role of dishonour in terms of all of the above, as it were. And Burma had all of that. Aung San Suu Kyi was probably the most celebrated political prisoner in the world, but she was under house arrest. I couldn't see her in the beginning of my time there. I know that, for example, when Robert was there, I think sometimes she was out, sometimes she was in under house arrest. It really was a pretty grim place. And that third bullet there about the fighting in ethnic areas, this is one that will come up quite a lot during the course of the remarks that I'll make. So then a quick contrast between using that same list and going across to the Burma I left. And as you know, success has 1,000 fathers, so I'll claim credit for most of that. But you can see sanctions were lifted, Suu is released, ceasefire signed. But actually the bit to look at is in the bottom right-hand corner. This, you look, there was no rule of law when I went, well, there still isn't. Corruption was rife, it still is. The people impoverished, there's a D, I'm afraid, missing off that. They are still impoverished with the D. And there's a new bad kid on the block. With the rise of, I don't know quite what you call it, is it anti-Muslim, is it sectarian, but violence focused around, or the reason given for it, that it's between Buddhists and Muslims, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that. So even though this, there has been huge progress, I mean, those things are serious. The achievements in the top right, there's still a lot to be done. It's a work in progress, and there is no guarantee yet of a happy ending. And I think that's why it's so inspiring for me to see so many people interested here, because I think the international community has a very important role to play in trying to keep to try to complete the job that's been started. So in a sense, what I'm going to try to do, many of you will know who the one on the right is. The one on the left is Senior General Thein Shwe. He was in charge in Burma until 2010, 2011. And I mean, the fact that he's not known, if you think of the great dictators of the world, you knew what they looked like. Very few Burmese didn't know what he looked like. I met him once to present credentials, and that was the last time I saw him. And it wasn't a particularly interesting discussion that we had that day. But I mean, I don't think he's going to come back. But it's which way does it go? Does it go back to where it was, and or is Dorsu one day going to be the president that the Burmese appear to want? So what I'm going to do, I've set the backdrop to the sanctions and things like that, but when I arrived, the immediate backdrop was the Saffron Revolution, which many of you will remember. This was the monks' protest. Over 200 people, it's probably way more than that, but I think there's a certain agreement that it was certainly no less than that, were killed. I mean, for those of you who know about Buddhist monks being beaten up and monks being arrested, this is serious, this doesn't happen. And so it was an incredibly powerful thing to see. And then, I mean, particularly with what's happening in the Philippines right now, I mean, Cyclone Nargis ripped through the delta, the southern delta area of Burma. I mean, 140,000 people were killed and many more made homeless. And then, as I arrived, Aung San Suu Kyi is on trial. So again, it's just part of the backdrop to a country that is truly benighted, or was truly benighted at that time. And it was quite interesting, actually, because the things I had to do in my first few weeks just really set the scene for what it was like at that point. And I first had to go up to Naypyitaw, and I'll talk in a minute about that. About 3 days in. So I arrived on Friday, and on Monday I had to go up to Naypyitaw. And then later that first week, Jane and I went down to the Delta area to see the to see how the place was being rebuilt or not after Cyclone Nargis. And then the week after that, Aung San Suu Kyi was on trial, and I was able to go to that. The Today programme, I'll explain that in a minute. And the other things that were there, which are interesting really, is hearing for the first time. I'd heard academically about the ethnic groups in Burma, and so I kind of understood it intellectually, but to hear representatives of the ethnic groups talking, and then to hear about this issue, the Rohingya, again I'd heard about it, but what was it? But interestingly enough, well, that will come back big time later on in my talk, but it was just trying to pull some of those things together. And Naypyitaw first. I mean, it's just a ridiculous place, and it is. It's built. The trip we had to do, we went up together, and it's a 10-hour round trip. So, and we did it in the day, and then you go up and you have some meetings, but it's hard just to describe what it's like. The report I wrote back had a lot of Lewis Carroll in it, and it genuinely, because it doesn't feel real. And some of the people in the room I know have been there. But this is possibly its most famous site, the 20-lane highway. I don't know, nobody knows quite how much it cost to build. It's estimated to be somewhere between $4 and $5 billion. This is a country that has a per capita income of about $1,000. Thailand is 10 times that. And this place, this is the parliament, and you can't get a photograph of the parliament that does it, because that's the front of it, and it is massive. And the trees there are quite big at the front. And when William Hague came over, he said there is a direct relationship between the size of the parliament and the nonsense of the democracy it's in. Because the smaller the parliament, the more democratic the country. I think he was probably right about that. And then again, this is a pagoda which is built in Naypyitaw. It's about a foot, I think, or a meter, nobody's quite sure, smaller than the Shwe. It's a magnificent, ancient Buddhist pagoda in Rangoon. Again, this has cost millions of pounds, of dollars and every other currency to do. And you then, the next week, I'm there. I didn't take this photograph. This was one. This is the aftermath of Cyclone Nargis, and you can see these people. And it wasn't just the tragedy. Well, it could have been certainly mitigated. It couldn't have been avoided. But 140,000 people had died in days. Now, hundreds and thousands, as I mentioned earlier, were left homeless. And if you think about the Philippines now, and the government there saying, take your aid away. We don't want your aid because we think you're trying to bring in guns and soldiers and spies. That's what happened in Burma. That aid said eventually it got in, but it got in much later than it should have done. And many, many people, to be quite honest, it was throughout a sense of indifference to what was happening to the people there. It was a shameful, shameful episode in the history of Burma and its government. And this is, again, you've seen the pictures from the Philippines, and everything that you saw there applies here. This is just one photograph, another one there. And this just shows, this is what the situation people were in. And a year later, it wasn't, there was improvements, and there were some solid, the most noticeable thing actually was they built, the international community got in, and also ordinary Burmese had got there to build concrete shelters. So if there were another Nargis, people would at least have somewhere to go where they wouldn't be killed. But there was a huge rebuilding job to be done, and I think the international community, once it did get in, and I think the UN and British NGOs and international NGOs did a great job. But it was tough going, particularly at the beginning. Week 3, and this grainy photograph, this is Dorsu appearing for the trial that she was on, and she was being tried for harbouring an American, some of you will remember this case, but an American freelancer, I don't know quite how to describe him really. He'd swum across the lake to her house, walked across the garden, and then had presented himself to Dorsu. And she had worried about him because he clearly wasn't complete. My American colleague describes his wiring was just a little bit different to the rest of us. And she didn't quite know what to do with him. So she gave him shelter for a short period and then handed him over. And she was on trial for that. And the trial was just the most extraordinary thing. It was a farce of a trial. I went along for, the diplomats, rather surprisingly, were allowed in to hear the verdict. And the verdict was initially, we all had translators behind us telling from our embassies telling us what had happened, was the sentence is 3 years hard labour, and for her and her 2 companions. And as we heard that, each of us, the diplomats, you heard them go around, you just couldn't believe it, don't talk too hard labour, this is 3 years, it was just too much. And then, like something out of a pantomime, everybody shuffled off, and this guy appears, who I now know was the Home Minister, in a uniform, with medals everywhere, and he puts out his pocket this thing, and he said, I have a message here from the Senior General, it's all in Burmese, but we can translate. I have a message here from the Senior General. If the sentence is to be 3 years hard labour, then the Senior General commands that it should be commuted to 1.5 years of house arrest. That's if the sentence is 3 years hard labour. And well, the rule of law point was pretty clear there. And I remember then getting back to the embassy, and the first thing when I got back was the Today programme want to interview, which is sort of both frightening and exciting. But again, that was one of numerous, quite high-profile media interviews I did, which I think, again, it was just how important Burma and Aung San Suu Kyi was to a Western audience. Part of this, as it were, learning curve was that's a map of Burma. Just very quickly to illustrate, around if Kachin State up in the top, and then coming down the eastern side of the country is where a lot of the ethnic issues. And it's not just there, but one of the difficulties that Burma is trying to cope with is how best to integrate the various ethnic groups into one society. And I think it's very important not to underestimate quite how difficult that is. It is, because the fighting has gone on without apportioning blame for what's happening. The reality of it now is that they've been fighting for many, many years. Now, thankfully, ceasefires have been signed with most of the groups, and there may be more ceasefires, one more ceasefire to come. But it is actually like having 10 or 11 Northern Islands going on around the border. And this has been a major part of why the military, for so long, were able to hold power. Because they were able to say that if we don't rule or keep this under control, the country will balkanize. Now, I'm not for a minute justifying what they did. But there was something in that. There was a risk of that. I think that we need to be clear about that. And I think brutal repression is probably not the way to deal with it. What's happening now with what appears to be a proper negotiation followed by political dialogue, maybe. And it's certainly a much better way to try to do it. But again, there are huge obstacles to be cleared to making the ceasefire arrangements then move into a more a lasting settlement. And on the purple, you can see on the left-hand side there, Rakhine State. That's which borders Bangladesh in its top corner. That is where they have 1 million Rohingya. When I arrived there, they are, and still, are denied rights of citizenship, which have major consequences for education, for marriage, for free movement. And that's where the initial sectarian violence and the anti-Muslim violence sparked later on during my time. So after that sort of baptism of fire and a very sharp learning curve, from around September 2009 up to the elections in November 2010, there was this kind of phony war going on. And we were all of us running around trying to get information about the elections. Would the NLD run? Would they not run? Would they be allowed to run? Would Dorsu be released? It was very difficult to know. What news about the election laws started to seep out and then eventually was published, and it became very clear that a lot of the laws were actually written specifically to make life as difficult as possible for the NLD to participate, including, for example, that no party could have serving political prisoners, for want of a better word, inside the party. So that meant the NLD was faced with kicking out Dorsu, which she wasn't that worried about that because she would have. But she told me subsequently. But for many of their people who were in prison, to be kicked out by the party was just unacceptable, and would have been the biggest kick in the teeth they could have done. And they're probably going to go into an election that isn't going to be run freely and fairly anyway. So why would you do it? And they concluded that was exactly the situation and decided not to participate. And as a result, the party was then subsequently disbanded because it became illegal. Thankfully now it's legal again, but that's another story. There were no international observers allowed for the elections. There was a diplomats tour, which we actually, the EU, didn't go on because it was so obviously choreographed around the place. And the results were rigged. I mean, they were just rigged on an industrial scale. And one of the stories, bizarrely, representatives of the parties, and some parties, genuinely democratic parties, did compete, and they were allowed in for the count. And what happened was this advanced votes. So what would happen is the votes would be counted, and Party X, who were a Democratic Party, would probably have won. And then they said it was literally like ordering a pizza. The guy would on his mobile phone and say, "We need another 3,000 here." And then we would carry boxes. And I kid you not, this is, I didn't see it personally, but so many people said it. And so there are some more advanced votes have arrived. He didn't send enough, and they would send another lot. And as a result, the government party won hugely. And those democratic parties that had agreed to enter the elections were left looking incredibly stupid. And in fact, pretty much disowned by many in the democracy movement. Because, well, why did you do it? You gave the elections a sense of legitimacy, and look what they did to you. But bizarrely, in the bottom bit there, the international press were allowed in to cover the elections. I mean, we're really confused about that, but anyway, they were. And it became clear why the following week, because the week after the elections, Dorsu was released from house arrest, which was, just the most amazing day. Well, there've been many amazing days in Burma, but this was right up there. And the one thing that, diplomats are incredibly competitive, and you do not want to be going back to your capital to say, "I was the second one in the door." So I said, "Jane, we've got to go down because it's the day of release." And we didn't know, nobody knew if she would actually be released. So there was nothing ahead of time. I said, "We've got to go down there," and you don't want to miss this, so he tracked it down. And I met my French colleague down there. That was okay because no, we were all just standing outside. And anyway, it became clear at that time, it was about 11 o'clock in the morning, nothing was happening. And I got back. I hope there's nobody from the BBC here because I could have killed you that day. And there was a ticker tape, on BBC World News ticker tape, the French ambassador in house with. Honestly, it was my world ended. So I ran running back. He wasn't in there at all. He'd gone home as well. I think his French ambassador spotted that compound. So anyway, but then she was released, and we were in the crowd out there. That's the gates. She would have literally been in a friendly way torn apart limb from limb if she'd gone out into the crowd that evening, because people were just so excited to see her. And I mean, joking apart, when the French ambassadors are getting in first, it was one of the most moving things I've ever been at, because there were literally thousands of people in the road, and it was very crushed and tight, but nobody minded, and people were just euphoric. And it really brought home to me that, this is not supposed to be some sort of love letter to Dorsu, but it really brought home to me what she meant to people. It was hope. That was what she meant. And there she was, and she was out, and whatever else is going on, suddenly hope had returned. And we were in this incredible scrum, just trying to see it, just taking in the atmosphere. And then John Simpson pops up out of absolutely nowhere. He's about, and you can see how surprised I was. He's about 7 foot, John Simpson. And I don't know, because I'm quite tall, or not tall, I'm about average height there. And he somehow was in the middle of all this crowd, and it was just a night of enormous euphoria. And then after that, it's kind of back to reality. And again, not quite clear what was happening. She'd been released, you'd have these rigged elections, but the elections took place in November, and Parliament didn't meet until the following April. And so there was again a bit of a phony period, nobody quite knowing, scrambling around looking for information. But eventually a new regime was selected. The president, Sein, I put former number 4 under Thein Shwe. It depends which source you go to. Some people say number 6, number 5. Crucially, he was lower than the Speaker of the lower house, a guy called Shwe Mann, who had been the former number 3, and he was expected to be appointed as the new president. In the speculation that was going on, this wasn't informed speculation. But the key thing was, firstly, that he was in there, but not in the top job. And you had the government and Parliament. I forget exactly how many ministers in the government, maybe 40. I think around 4 were not members of the previous regime. So you got the vast majority of ministers. The Parliament's got we've got a 25% military bloc, plus around 80% of the government-approved party. So, and nobody quite knew where Thein Shwe, the former senior general, was in all of this either. So, what happened then? Well, the main thing, as it felt to me at the time, was that there seemed to be a sense of trying to marginalise ASSK. It was enough to let her out, but she was not, the government weren't talking to her in any meaningful way. It was up in Naypyitaw with a 20-lane highway, 5 hours away. She was down in Rangoon, and she was largely being ignored. From the perspective of me and the other diplomats, it was wonderful in a way, because we had great access to her at that point. And again, you could just, it was just amazing to be able to ring up and say, look, could I go and see Dorsu today? Or sometimes she'd ask if she could see me or other colleagues. And you saw all the things that you expect, the charisma, the intelligence, the steel. And make no mistake, there's a core of steel runs through Dorsu, which you would need in her circumstances. But up in Naypyitaw, I was going and speaking to ministers, and it was still the same. We were really a dialogue of the deaf. There was nothing new. It just felt like, and it really did look back, looked like it was just going to be more of the same. And we're just with ASSK release. The president made his first speech. That was the first glimmer of hope, where he talked in quite a positive way about some of the changes that he wanted to make. And but it also included some messages that were quite clearly aimed at some of the ethnic groups. You fit in, or it's going to be trouble for you guys. And then it wasn't actually this conversation. This is just a show off that I had to but there were 2 conversations that made me think something's happening. And the first was with Dorsu. It was around July of 2011. And we were going through, in fact it was a little earlier, sorry, it was a little bit earlier than that. We were going through some convulsions, as we did within the EU, about what do we do with our quite heavy sanctions regime. And there were some within the EU who wanted to relax it, to try and encourage the new government to say, look, we not relax it totally, but to make some moves. And she said to me, look, don't do that now, because if you do, there is a power struggle going on up in Naypyitaw. And if you do, you're going to give a message to the hardliners that they don't need to do anything for you to start making changes. Made sense to me, so that was fine. And then I had a conversation in Naypyitaw with the minister, who said the words that I never thought I'd hear from a government minister who'd been part of the old regime, and he said, look, we made mistakes, we made some horrible mistakes previously. I don't know what to say to him. But he, and that suddenly made me think, okay, well, if ministers suddenly talk like that and also say that, then maybe there's just something happening here. So, and I think that was the first straw in the wind. And then we had this, it wasn't much reported, but Burma used to have multiple exchange rates, so members of the government could change, I think it was a 1,000 chat for about, a chat for about $6. So it meant that they could make a huge amount of money with this exchange rate, whereas the rate on the street was about $8.50. So, and we knew from the little bits we could get out of Naypyitaw that there was a big fight going on about the new president wanting to change that, and the hardliners didn't want him to do it, and it got changed. Then I had another conversation with Aung San Suu Kyi, who said she'd had an approach from the government, and they had asked her to consider re-registering the NLD and they would be prepared to change the party laws of registration if she would fight the by-elections. She said, I don't quite know where to go with this, but I am prepared to give it a go. And this was difficult because it meant opening a dialogue with the government, and she knew there was a risk that lobby groups both in the UK and elsewhere were going to be very critical of her for doing this. And so she said, look, I want you, and it wasn't only me, I'm sure she said it to other ambassadors too, I want you to go back to the UK, talk to the lobby there, and ask them to give this a chance. So, yes, I'm going to do that. And I did. And it turned out to be, that she was actually right. It was worth giving a chance. And then we had this incredible period from September of 2011 through to April of 2012, which is just, I can't describe really how the momentum of the changes just sort of were, and nobody could, they happened quickly, they happened unexpectedly, and Suu met the president in conversation, which went well. The bit Sundan was up in Kachin State, the Chinese project, and the president was a very unpopular project. And the president just said, right, it's suspended like that. I didn't warn the Chinese, unless my Chinese colleague was an amazingly good liar. They had no warning at all that this was going to happen. And you don't, in Burma, you didn't do that to China. Political prisoners, 200 were released, more were released later. We started to get the visits. Andrew Mitchell then differed, Minister went. Hillary Clinton, of course, that was a massive visit. William Hague went over and wrecked my Christmas. Very soon after the New Year, but that was one of the more important things. And the president gave a speech reaching out to ethnic groups, and this again, this was really sort of took us all apart, by surprise. See these two photographs here. This is Hillary Clinton. You'll see it in Naypyitaw. This is William Hague. And the point about it, the reason I put them both in Naypyitaw, these photographs, is I cannot describe Hillary Clinton in Naypyitaw. Just wasn't going to happen when I arrived. And there she was. And there was William Hague coming over and meeting the president. And as you know, Obama came subsequently. Then we got to the by-elections in 2012, and this was truly the seminal moment, because this was a test of how sincere the government was going to be. They'd rigged a constitutional vote back in, if my memory is right, 2008. They had rigged the elections in 2010. They'd annulled the results of the 1990 election. If the by-elections were rigged, then this was obviously just one great con trick, or indeed if they were messed about with, really, it was one. And we knew that all this encouragement we'd given, and we'd all kind of put ourselves a bit out on a limb, politicians much more than me, saying, we're prepared to give this a chance. I mean, they're really stupid if they do this, but they didn't. The elections weren't perfect, but there was a landslide for the NLD in those elections. I think 45 seats were fought, and they won 43 of them. And the result from that was that the sanctions were suspended. And then just at the bottom, one interesting thing, which I think now sort of plays in maybe a little bit to what's happening now. A senior minister I spoke to there after the elections said to me, what is she doing? I said, what do you mean? And she said, you're going out campaigning everywhere. Why is she doing that? I said, well, that's what politicians do. They go out campaign, but no, she's going outside her constituency. So what she's doing, she's the leader of the NLD and they're standing all these seats. So, but really it would be much better if she stayed in her constituency, and then probably the results would have ended up about even. And he was a reformer, and I don't want to be, I'm not trying to mock him, it was just, that was how he saw it. Well, what is she doing? Just win your constituency, get a parliamentary seat and you move on. But the campaign trail was literally unbelievable. I talked about the joy outside the house, but this was like a second coming as she went across the country. And she's in an open-top car there. And one time, on what was a trip to visit a DFID project, I was in the car with her. And that's a really dangerous place to be, because you can see her handing the thing down, and you're sat there, and so you've got flowers, you've got fruit, you've got all landing on your head. You're trying to be a distinguished ambassador, there's a bag of crisps. But more seriously than that was this, just you see the crowds there, tens of thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands turned out to greet her. And this is another rally, I think this one was in Mann. And the enthusiasm was just extraordinary. And she's an old-fashioned, I don't want to use a John Major soapboxing campaigner. That's her campaign style. It's with the loudspeaker, engaging with the audience. And I'm afraid, to my shame, don't speak Burmese, but you didn't need to. It was just it was clear what she was saying. It was resonating, and she won. And her decision to participate was fully justified. And as I mentioned there, earlier there was 44 constituencies of the NLD contest, and they won 43. And I remember speaking to her afterwards and saying, that's amazing. You won 43. And she said, yeah, well, 44th has really annoyed me. The guy didn't campaign properly. I just wondered how a British politician would take it. 97% or whatever it was. Maybe she was a bit annoyed about it. And we then had this honeymoon period from those elections through till September, and a little bit beyond. September, there was a sort of point where you started to sense things were going a little bit wrong. But the amount of change in that time, the signing of the ceasefires was massive. And it counts for nothing if the political dialogue doesn't follow. And those of us who followed the Northern Ireland campaign knew there were many ceasefires. The dialogue didn't happen. It went back until eventually a solution was solved. And that's where we're at now with those ceasefires, unless the dialogue happens. But the ceasefires were a huge improvement. The EU we suspended our sanctions. The Prime Minister came, Secretary General came, Dorsu came here. And this point about the literary festival, I'll come on to in a minute, but that was another real sign of openness on the part of the government. And this is the Roy. I hope you don't mind. I didn't ask your permission to use your photograph. But this was an event that we put on. Jane, my wife, had the idea, and ran it. Dorsu was a patron, and you had a number of international authors like Aung Chang and Fergal Keane and Sept. That was remarkable enough. We had 120 Burmese authors speaking about themes that were unthinkable that they could have spoken about earlier. 10,000 people came through the doors for the festival. And it was, all the press, everything else we did in the embassy counted for nothing compared to the publicity we got for this. And of course it was Jane's idea, which was annoying. But it was a massive expression of freedom of speech. And the Burmese sent a junior minister, but they did send a minister along every day. And so we're trying to think, all these things happening, which is wonderful. Why did it open up at that time? And I'm afraid that's the diplomat's answer always is the top one, and so no change there. I think the Arab Spring, had an influence, but perhaps not the dramatic influence that it seemed, because it did seem to be almost, the Arab Spring happened, and then after that, the Burmese changed their tune. I'm not sure it was actually as dramatic as that, but I do think it did strike them, the popular protest is happening again, and I think they would have repressed it, and I think the army would have done it again, I'm afraid, but they didn't want to do that, and so it may have had an impact. Was it China having excessive influence? The price of Chinese political support in the UN Security Council and elsewhere was massive, and they had to pay a heavy price for that, particularly economically. Was it an elaborate contract? Just do enough to get the sanctions lifted, to get the world off your back, but don't really change anything. The fact is the army still stays as a dominant force and the political power doesn't shift, maybe. An economic meltdown, and the economic problems in Burma were and are still very profound. Well, I think some of the ministers, particularly as part of ASEAN, the bottom one there, they were travelling much more to ASEAN meetings. And that was, I think the West would have kind of preferred them to be kicked out of ASEAN. But the fact they were going to places that used to be way behind them, like Vietnam and other places, and seeing how developed those societies were, and how developed those economies were, and how much richer the people were, I think did actually have an influence. And they had the ASEAN chair, which they now are coming up. And I think all these things kind of mixed together Probably different people had different motives, but probably most of those were in the mix. So the Prime Minister came out to Burma. I love these two pictures because you look at the body language of the Prime Minister. and then with Dorsu. But there he was. The British Prime Minister was in Naypyitaw, and that visit coincided with the suspension of EU sanctions. Was suspended pretty quickly after that, and then Dorsu came here and gave a speech to the two Houses of Parliament. And I mean, the point about her being a star, yes, she is, and everybody thinks she's great, but I mean, this is actually a serious issue, because when you're a president and you've been reforming everything you can think about reforming, it's actually everyone wants to see ASSK. And I'll come on to the president a little bit later, but the reception she got in Dublin, here, London, Paris, really, I think the message for the Burmese guys back in Naypyitaw, the stardust is still very, very real. And the fact as a leader of an opposition party, she got to give a speech to both Houses of Parliament was amazing. It's very difficult for heads of state to get that, let alone a leader of the opposition. And I think this, you have to think about what were they thinking back in Naypyitaw when the reformers thinking, well, and I think this is playing in a little bit, possibly, to what is happening now, because this slide here marks the beginning of the end of the honeymoon, and it doesn't look like it, because that's, well actually, I think Dorsu does look like this is a picture taken in New York. They were both in New York. It was the first time they'd agreed to be in the same place at the same time, and the reason, I mean actually, Dorsu had always been happy to be in the same place as the President. The President wasn't quite so keen, and but they did this photograph together in New York. And to the world, it looked like there they are standing together, ready to take the next part of the reform program on. But in fact, this is the point where, for reasons, I'm not doing a sort of SIS thing here, but I can't go into all of them now because they were told to me in confidence. But things were starting to happen then, which were showing the relationship to be pretty strained. And whether that was because the government side thought she was getting too much credit for things, whether it was just general animosity over the years where she had been perceived or portrayed by the government as being it's almost like a devil figure. I mean, really some of the stuff that they would put around about her was really extraordinary. I don't know, but the fault lines then at that point really did start to emerge, and I think the ceasefire, there wasn't a ceasefire signed in Kachin, which is the most northern part of Burma, and the fighting continued up there. And the significance of that was that the president, on at least one occasion, and probably more, ordered the army to stop, and they didn't. And this, again, starts to show, well, how much control does he have over the army? And without control over the army, the president's in a much weaker position than might appear to be the case. Political prisoners, by this stage, most of the political prisoners have been released, and all the big names, every political prisoner is a big name in a way, but all of the ones who were internationally known have been released. But others were still being held and they weren't being released. It started to look like there was a bit of a game of cards going on, which wasn't in keeping with this new government that we're hearing about. Just release them. And you then had the outbreaks of anti-Muslim violence. And I think at this point there was a sense of drift starting to emerge. And the response of the government to the anti-Muslim violence down in Rakhine State was equivocal. It really wasn't a strong response that we in the international community were talking to. And what you also then started to see the relationships at the top were starting to go wrong. Just you talk to the people themselves or people close to them, start to get there's rivalries coming between the parliament and the president. There's rivalries, issues between the president and Dorsu, and these three really need to work together to stop it drifting, and to move it forward. But they weren't, and this was starting to happen as we moved into the latter part of 2012. So the issues, there are many issues which remain, and many of them are listed up there. But the main issue really is about the people of Burma, because once you've got these expectations going, they are expecting much more than they're getting, and this is a real issue. And the other 2 points I would pick up on, the constitutional position on Dorsu, I think most of you will know about it. It's that she is able to run for parliament. She is an MP now, and the NLD can contest the elections, but she is barred from becoming president because of particular provisions in the constitution. And if you are going to go fully to democracy, then you've got to allow the person who is unquestionably the most popular politician in Burma to stand. And nobody quite knows what the president thinks, and we can. It's very much in doubt whether the constitution will be amended in time for the elections in 2015. And the last point here, the rise of Buddhist extremism. This is really important. From the outside, it looks like a pretty straightforward case of one group in the population beating up on another, and at some levels it is that simple. But during the dark years, when you had no pride in your government, your leader was under house arrest, you couldn't see her, hear her, you had no pride in your country, you went, what did you find? Well, most Buddhists reverted to Buddhism. That was the thing that they held onto. And so when a perception comes of that being under threat, not necessarily from the Rohingya in Rakhine State, but that when anti-Muslim violence, the violence first sparked, which actually in the first case seemed to be a spontaneous two communities just beating up on each other, and then the reaction of the Islamic press, particularly some of the more extreme elements, were to suddenly focus on these people, animals and so on. This really got a lot of the Buddhist population in Burma very dug in. And what has happened to some of the Muslims in Burma is awful, and the conditions they're living in. But and I'm not justifying what's happened in any way at all. But as with any conflict, in Northern Pakistan, wherever it is profoundly more complicated than it appears sometimes from the outside. I mean, overall, where's Burma heading? I mean, I think it is. Amazing progress has been made, and it's been done peacefully. And that is, if you think about what's happening in the Arab world, very little of it's been done peacefully. So what's happened in Burma is remarkable. But there are, what is going to happen next? The problems I went through exist, they are still there. And how committed is a president and his government to seeing those reforms through? And I'm not, I'll talk a bit more about the president in a moment. But what he's done is he's allowed a democratic and liberalising light to shine in on Burma. And he's unleashed in that expectations that he and his government have got to try to meet. And so looking to the next stage, I think there are sort of four key players there. The fact is, this is still much more about individuals and institutions. And that's not surprising, perhaps, at this stage of a democracy. But these, I think, three individuals and the armed services as a group are the key people now. Sein, I mean, I met him many times, sort of sitting in there when William Hague would come and David Cameron would come and other visitors. And I've met him on a one-to-one basis once or twice. He's he's an incredibly modest guy, and he's a very likeable man. And I think he does deserve huge credit for what he's achieved. But he now does face a very difficult dilemma in how far does he want to go. And I suppose the question he has to ask is how much of this is about his legacy? Does he want to run again for the presidency, or does he want to step away with a legacy which, even if it stopped now, would be disappointing if it hadn't gone further during his time, but would be quite impressive? Or does he want to be a pander, play to the old guard and some of the hardliners? And at the moment, and I don't want to be unfair to a man for whom I developed quite a lot of admiration in the time I was there, but there isn't much sign of boldness right now. And I suppose in the end, this is why the speculation now is really raging. Why did he do it? We talked about, well, was it economics, was it China, but why did he do it? And why then is he now slowing down? And is this because he's worried that he's gone so far that if he takes it much further, there's going to be a backlash from the hardliners? Maybe. Was it always actually the plan, so as I said earlier, to make some changes, just do enough to get the international community back engaged, get investment back in, and then stop it while you keep power with the same people, with the army in a very dominant position? Or is it also an issue of lack of experience? Now, this guy worked for his whole life, really, inside the army and inside Thein Shwe's regime. He had no political experience, everything was top down. And actually building coalitions and having to rule and to lead in that way is probably very counterintuitive for him. I'm afraid I simply don't know the answer between those three. And I just hope it's not the fourth one, yes, that the idea was always to keep power with the old guard. I hope it isn't, and I'm not saying that it is. Dorsu, I mean, she, people have been, as you've seen, there's a lot more criticism around about Dorsu now. And when I've spoken to her about it, she accepts that's part of what it's like as a politician. She accepts that's part of the lot of it. But she is unquestionably, what I saw in the by-elections, she will win by a landslide. If there is a free and fair election in Burma in 2015, she'll win it, and the NLD will win by a landslide. She has tried very much. She is frustrated, as she said, very publicly. She's frustrated with the way things are going in Burma now and with the government. The question for her is, what will she do? If she is barred from running for president, will she actually holds this now in her hand. If she walks away, then that's going to let a lot of the countries and companies that are, the countries engaging, the companies investing are going to be placed in a much more, have a big question to answer. So inadvertently, the Burmese authorities may be giving her the key to where it goes next. And she's talked, a bit about what she might do, but right now, constitutional change is her mantra, and that's what she wants the international community to pursue. Then, Thura Shwe Mann, I don't know how many people have heard of him. He was expected to be the president in 2011. I say expected, this wasn't like speculation running in 5 national newspapers and people appearing just what we heard at cocktail parties, but he was. And the really interesting thing about him, I've again met him, he would normally be one of the people who would be out there when visitors would come. And he just has a charisma. It's very quiet. It's not like Dorsu's. It's not stardust, but you just think this is a serious guy. And he's forged a relationship with Dorsu, which was very unexpected because they were foes previously. But they get on. They respect each other. And he's really built up the parliament, which again everyone thought was just going to be a rubber stamping operation. He's built it up into actually a very serious institution. He said he's going to run for president. He said also that he wants to run in a fair fight. He wants constitutional change to happen, and he wants to contest against Dorsu. And I've heard her say to him in front of everybody, I'll win, don't you? She probably would, but he says he doesn't want to become president in some rigged election. So we'll see quite how that... I mean, some people speculate that maybe if constitutional change becomes impossible, she has to accept that because it's simply not going to happen, she might accept him as president. Don't know. When I've ever asked her about that, that's one of the questions she doesn't answer. The army, the other key area, and they also, if the army were to agree to constitutional change, it will happen. They have a 25% block. To change the constitution, you need 75% of the parliament, and they've got 25% of it. So I think there is actually enough, the 74%, you can probably get in the Burmese parliament now, but without the army it doesn't count. So they really do hold the key to whether there is constitutional change. We don't know what their view on the ethnic issues really are, and they've fought these guys for years. Their men have died, and they make a lot of money out of, as with any conflict like that, there's money's been made on both sides, and they're part of it. They also have a hugely privileged position inside the economy, and no president can really operate without the confidence of the army and knowing that they have the support of the army. Question there, should the West engage with them? My answer is yes, we should. I don't think we should be selling tanks or anything like that, but I do think one of the most striking visits we had when I was there was when the UK Chief of Defence Staff came, and he talked to the Commander-in-Chief about the respect the Army have here. And of all the stuff we talked about with the Commander-in-Chief, this made an impact. He said, how does this respect work? And he said, look, we are seen as people who support the democracy. We don't run it. Sometimes we want to, but we don't. But we support the democracy, and that's why the people respect us. They know they can count on us to do the job. And I'm not saying that's going to mean a sudden volte-face from the army, but it clearly, that idea. They were the guardians of Burma in the both pre and post-independence time. So in terms of the key issues, I've already touched on most of them, so I won't really spend very much time here. I think there is a risk. These are not in any particular order, apart from the stream of consciousness when I was putting this together. The anti-Muslim violence is a real issue beyond just the horrors of the violence so far, because there is for some of the old guard the attraction of attaching yourself to a Buddhist nationalist, not really Buddhist nationalism, it's Burmese nationalism, in attaching yourself to that. Look at it's like the National Front in. There's a core of the population who may go for that, and that could be suddenly a vehicle for some of the hardliners to find they have no political platform now. Maybe in the worst case scenario they could leap upon that. And I think the people of Burma are far too sensible to allow that to happen. But I mean, it is the violence, and what does the army do if it really gets out of control? That is, this is what opening stuff up actually leads to, so it's best we go back to where we were before. The same, I think, applies on the ethnic conflict. The third one is interesting because, demonstrations now are to a penny in Burma. And I would drive around the streets and you'd see, a demonstration against power shortages, see another one against a particular company. People are now expressing themselves by going to the streets, which they couldn't do before. That, there is a risk if things get really serious, and the economy is absolutely, so a hell of a mess that people could start to protest. And actually that's, there were lots of reasons for the protests in '88 and 2007, but economic factors were very much part of those. The government can't achieve very much because of the relationship between the government and the parliament, so many of the changes they want to make, they can't because they're blocked in parliament. And then, of course, you get the two biggest fears, really, that in 2015 the elections will either be rigged or they're allowed to be free and fair, and the leader of the most popular party can't become president. What does that all mean to the future? So I think there is a really serious risk of drift in Burma in the coming years. I hope there won't be. I think it ultimately probably does come down to the president. He's got to grip some of these difficult issues. He's got to take another raft of difficult decisions. Whether he'll do that, well, time will tell. And I think, rather sort of depressing note to finish on, but a quote from Dorsu when she was last here. She was on the Today programme, and they've had the interview with Sein, and it's quite a key. There's the point. Constitutional change is absolutely fundamental to the future of Burma being if it's to be a democratic society. It's enough from me. I'll leave you with Dorsu's quote. Thank you very much indeed.